Today we'll learn about the executive branch, primarily the president. We'll learn about the executive branch's purpose, the president's powers, and the unique voting system that the United States uses to every 4 years elect a new president. Just like the legislative branch, the executive branch has two levels, federal and state. The federal executive branch is headed by the president. The state executive branch is led by the governor. The executive branch has one main purpose, to enforce the laws. An easy way to remember this is executive starts with an E and enforce starts with an E. The president has a couple important powers. The first is executive orders. As we know, Congress makes laws, but executive orders allow the president to make laws without Congress giving their okay. The second thing the president can do is make treaties. Because the president talks and deals with many foreign leaders almost on a daily basis, he can make formal agreements or deals with other nations.
What I'd like to do now is go into some more depth about this very controversial power of executive orders. Executive orders, as you can read here, say that they're almost like a law. They're these binding orders or commands that the president gives, and they're controversial. And the reason why they're controversial is because the president doesn't need Congress's approval to pass an executive order. Now, you should be thinking to yourself, this goes against checks and balances. We learned that in Unit 2. Well, that's why executive orders are controversial. Courts, we talked about courts, well, we're going to talk about courts in the next unit, have the ability to declare executive orders unconstitutional. However, that doesn't happen very often. But executive orders can be checked. Now, executive orders, you might be thinking, okay, they're really bad. They make the president look like a king. Well, executive orders can be a positive tool for the president. For instance, during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln freed all the slaves in the South or in the Confederacy using something called the Emancipation Proclamation, which is just a fancy name for an executive order. However, executive orders can also be negative. During World War II, the United States government under Franklin Roosevelt put all the Japanese Americans, what you call Nisei, into these internment camps in order to protect the rest of the United States. The Supreme Court said that this was okay because of safety concerns. However, years and years later, in like the early 90s, the U.S. government officially apologized to the families and victims of this internment and gave these people some money.
Now, how does this system of president, cabinet, and regulatory agencies work? They are organized in a hierarchy, just like a business, like a restaurant. Let me show you what I mean. At the top of your screen, the president leads the executive branch, like the owner of a restaurant leads his or her business. In the middle, we have the cabinet. The cabinet gives advice and handles day-to-day problems. These advisors are like managers, handling employees and letting the owner know what is happening in their restaurant. Finally, at the bottom, we have regulatory agencies. These are the cooks, waiters, bartenders, and bussers at the restaurant, carrying out all the small details that must be done to make their business work. Now, even though the president is usually a very smart person, they still need help sometimes. The president's official advisors are known as the cabinet. This group of people gives advice to the president on a variety of issues. For example, Secretary of Defense would give the president what kind of advice? That's right, defense and military advice. Good job. final piece of this executive branch puzzle is regulatory agencies. You've probably heard of many of these before. They enforce the millions of specific laws that Congress and the President create. Look at this list. How many do you recognize?
One of the most confusing aspects of the government for any American, and studies the American government, is the whole electoral college setup. Because when people often think of the word college, they think of a 4-year university where you get a higher education. Well, the word college has another meaning, and we'll talk about that in just a second. There are 2 types of votes you have when you deal with the electoral college. You have something called the popular vote, and the popular vote is just very simply you add up all the votes somebody casts for a candidate. That's just the raw number of votes a candidate receives. Jumping down to number 3 here, you have the electoral vote. And the electoral vote is important. These are the votes that we use to elect the president. And each state gets a certain amount of electoral votes that are proportional to a state's population. So the key word here is proportional. So what that means is the bigger a state's population, the more electoral votes the state gets. So a state like California, New York, or Texas, they have lots and lots of people, therefore they get lots and lots of electoral votes. The Electoral College is how we use this. The Electoral College is just the system that describes how we elect both the president and the vice president every 4 years. Every 4 years. These 3 questions are something you want to keep in mind as we go through the rest of this PowerPoint in terms of electing the president. First, what are the constitutional requirements to becoming president? Second, what is the Electoral College? We're going to go into more detail on that. And third, why did George W. Bush beat Al Gore in the 2000 election, even though Al Gore had more popular votes than George Bush? That seems like ancient history to some of you, but to many of us, that just seems like yesterday. The 2 most important requirements to becoming president is the following. First, you have to be a natural-born U.S. citizen. And this is a rarely controversial one, meaning, let's say you're Arnold Schwarzenegger. Arnold Schwarzenegger is the governor of California. He was born in Austria, I believe. Some people would love him to be president. However, as our Constitution is written in 2009, Arnold Schwarzenegger and many others born outside the U.S. could never become president. How could we go about changing these requirements? Constitutional amendment, of course. The second requirement is that you have to be at least 35 years old. And as you've noticed, when you deal with the House, when you deal with the Senate, each one of these seats has certain age requirements. The House is the youngest requirement, the Senate's in the middle, and the presidency has the highest age requirement. You'll notice that you often have to be older to have more powerful, more prestigious seats in Washington. One aspect that doesn't follow this rule is a Supreme Court justice, because a Supreme Court justice doesn't have to have any specific age requirements. The first step in electing the president is that eligible voters, people that are, citizens, 18 and older, some states have requirements barring convicted criminals or people who were once convicted of criminals. That's controversial. We're not going to get into that, but you primarily have to be a citizen of the United States and at least 18. And what they do every 4 years is they cast their ballots. What that means is you go to the polls, the voting polls, and you either, use a pencil or use a computer screen or some other method of choosing who you want to be president of the United States. This step gets a little bit confusing, but we will break it down very simply. As we noted earlier in vocabulary we were looking at, we talked about something called the popular vote. And the popular vote is when you add up all the votes for a certain candidate. That's the popular vote. The way this works in pretty much every state except for a couple, the candidate that wins most of a state's popular vote, or plurality, who has the most votes, gets all of that state's electoral votes. So I'll say that again. The candidate that wins most of a state's popular vote, that's the raw number of votes casted for somebody, gets all of that state's electoral votes. Electoral votes depend on the size of the state. So California, Texas, Florida, New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, these states have the most electoral votes because these states have lots and lots of people. Many people often make the argument that your vote doesn't count in the Electoral College, when it really does. It matters at the state level because you have a voice in determining whether your state goes Republican or goes Democrat or chooses somebody else. So, after the states start reporting in who they are giving their electoral votes to based on the state's popular vote, a president is eagerly trying to get that magic number of 270 electoral votes. There are currently 538 total electoral votes, and according to the Constitution, you need to have a majority, which is very specific here, more than 50% of all electoral votes to become president. And so the first person, and well, the only person that gets to this magic 270 votes, they become president. Because if you divide 270 over 538, you get the smallest of smallest majorities. It is possible that a candidate could get 269 and another candidate could get 269, and then we would have a little bit of a mess. But the Constitution says something about that too. But we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So the key here, you want to get that magic number of 270. When a candidate receives this magic number of 270 electoral votes, they become the president. And even though we do our voting in November, the new president doesn't take over until the following January. And so there's this, what we call lame duck period, where the former president is there. He still has the constitutional powers, but most people really don't think he has too much political power in trying to persuade and get things done. Here's an image from the 2000 election, I believe, where George W. Bush and his family is taking the oath from then Chief Justice William Rehnquist. Since then, Chief Justice William Rehnquist has passed away, and as many of you know, George W. Bush is no longer our president. I love this photo of Al Gore because he is angry. He is very, very angry. He did win the national popular vote. But as we mentioned earlier, the national popular vote really doesn't matter. What matters is the national electoral vote. Because the electoral vote determines if you become president or not. You remember, as we said before, how many electoral votes do you need to become president? 270. I always think about I-270 in Montgomery County, but you need 270 electoral votes. Most times in American history, the person that wins the national popular vote often gets the national electoral vote. In 2004, George Bush got the national vote. He got the electoral vote. In 2008, Barack Obama, he won the national popular vote. He also won the national electoral vote. However, from time to time, when the election is really, really tight, as it was in 2000, Sometimes you can win the national vote, but you don't win the national electoral vote. We keep track of these numbers just because it's very easy, but the one that counts the most is that electoral vote. This rarely happens, but if no candidate wins a majority of the electoral votes, then it's up to the House of Representatives to decide who becomes president. This hasn't happened in over 100 years. The most famous example is the election of 1876, where you have the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, which pretty much ended Reconstruction in the South. Some people think that's a pretty dark time in American history. It really depends on your viewpoint. I don't want to go down that path. Let's stick to government here. But it's important to know that if the Electoral College doesn't give us a majority, then the House picks the president. That doesn't happen very often, but this question often does come up on the HSA.